Hi, I'm Justin Wolfe, Associate Professor of History at Tulane University. And today I want to give you a brief overview of the idea of a canal across Central America. Starting from its earliest history, when the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, from that early geography and history, I'll turn to ideas of westward expansion in the US and the idea of crossing Central America, first as a combination of steamships and overland crossings, and eventually the construction of a canal. From there, we'll turn to the building of the canal, which was an engineering marvel, but not without environmental and human cost. We'll then look at the impact the canal has had on Panama, from underdevelopment to the financialization of its economy. Last, I'll turn to the more recent history of the canal in Central America, from the need to expand Panama's canal to account for new supertankers, to Nicaragua's hope to build a competitive canal with the aid of Chinese financing. The Spanish showed an awareness of the potential to cross Central America from the beginning. Early maps from the mid-1500s through the early 1600s show both the narrowness of the isthmus across Panama, but also a real attention to focusing on it as a potential trade route. There were, of course, two obvious potential crossing sites in Central America at the time. The first, of course, was Panama, just 40 miles across. The second, however, was in Nicaragua. There was a river, the Rio San Juan, mostly navigable from the Caribbean up to the Lake of Nicaragua, then crossing the lake, and finally a 12-mile overland pass between La Virgen on the coast of the lake and San Juan del Sur on the Atlantic. This was a little bit longer, but it was also flatter and less treacherous than the Panama route. Panama was mountainous and had rivers that overflowed their banks regularly. It also was slightly hotter and more tropical, an issue that we'll discuss later. Given the impracticality of building a canal in the 1500s and the Spanish need for a transit route to get trade from the silver and gold mines in Peru and Bolivia, the Americas, and into Spain, Panama became the best site for such an endeavor. Ships would bring these valuable goods up coast to the west of Panama, where they would cross overland to the east and then be shipped via Havana on to Spain. This shows the importance of Panama for Spanish trade, but it also revealed its geostrategic importance. Pirates frequently attacked ships along the Panamanian coast, and the building of fortresses and the sense of having to control this potential sea lane took on an even greater importance. The first serious efforts to cross Central America came after the California gold rush in 1849. There had been efforts to move westward for decades as part of U.S. expansion to the west. The idea of manifest destiny drew people towards California and the hopes of trade along the Pacific. But the overland route was difficult and time-consuming, and ships around the Tierra del Fuego were even longer and more dangerous. People began crossing via Mexico, Nicaragua, and Panama having the most numerous number of passengers. But the U.S. Civil War between 1861 and 1865, and then the completion of a transcontinental railroad in 1869, meant that interest in these overland routes diminished. Finally, in the early 1880s, as ocean-going cargo took on ever greater importance in global trade, renewed interest emerged. No route would be easy, and so engineers looked at a range of possibilities. Similarly, for each of the countries potentially involved, there would be a windfall, and so they looked to encourage these prospects. One idea was to move across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec that crossed over southern Mexico, approximately 130 miles. This would be too long for a canal, but many engineers thought that a railway of some kind could be feasible. James Eads, one of the greatest engineers in American history, who built the first bridge to span the Mississippi River, had an idea of a railway system that could carry ships from one side to the other. Although intriguing to envision, it did not seem particularly practical. The French engineer de Lesseps tried to build a canal across Panama in 1880, but gave up in 1889 after numerous French deaths and a lack of funding. The U.S. made a series of efforts beginning in the 1880s across Nicaragua, going as far as building docks, wharves, harbors, and even the beginnings of a canal. But this too collapsed in the early 1890s as U.S. economic woes caused people to fear investing. Finally, in 1903, after aiding Panama in securing its independence on the promise of a concession for the canal, it began a project that would be completed in 1914. With this project, the U.S. established its hegemony over the region, ensuring control of east-west travel, traffic, warships, and cargo. Building the canal was no simple task. Panama's landscape was difficult, mountainous, with lots of rivers and lakes that overflowed their boundaries, crossed through tropical jungle with an average rainfall of 105 inches a year and average temperatures of 80 degrees. Malaria and yellow fever were endemic to the region, something the French discovered to their own peril. In fact, this was a part of the failure of the French effort to build a canal. The death of approximately 20,000 people in that early effort is a significant element of what led to its failure. When the U.S. took over in 1903, it began a decade-long project. It employed 56,000 workers, 10% or 5,600 of whom died during the process. The task was an engineering marvel. It involved building dams, flooding plains to build lakes, the building of locks to move the ships up and down from sea level to the higher levels of the lakes, earth moving, and railroads. By the end of its completion, the U.S. had spent close to $400 million on the task. The canal was expected to be a boon to the Panamanian economy, and in many ways it was. First, it brought construction jobs, and then there were the ongoing fees of ships passing through the canal. But Panamanians themselves saw no significant development of the economy for them. Today, 9,000 people work on the Panama Canal, and while that's a fairly good number, it pales in comparison to the overall Panamanian population. Given the reality that the canal was not going to produce jobs on its own, Panama looked to other means of expanding. In 1948, Panama created a free trade port as a way of incentivizing global corporations to center themselves in Panama. It also established itself as it had negotiated a treaty with Nicaragua in 1914 that gave it the exclusive rights to build a canal across the territory. Because it already controlled in perpetuity the canal in Panama, it had no incentive to do so, and this left Nicaragua with no options. Finally, in 1970, the Nixon administration abrogated the treaty. Nicaraguans hoped they would have some option because the Panama Canal was showing its age. At this point, 55 years after its completion, the Panama Canal was too small to handle the supertankers that now plied the world. In 1972, a massive earthquake leveled the capital city of Managua, and the failure of the Somoza regime to respond in a way that seemed humane gave a boost to the revolutionary organization of the Sandinistas, who would in turn overthrow Somoza by 1979. The Sandinistas also considered building a canal, but the war against the US-backed Contras made that impossible too. Finally, with a period of stability in the early 2000s, Nicaragua began to look seriously at a plan. This first version, however, was not a canal in the traditional sense, but what was called a canal seco, or dry canal, imagined either as a huge railway network or as a massive highway project that would connect the eastern and western sides of the country. The idea brought lots of resistance from indigenous groups through whose land the canal would pass, as well as environmentalists who considered expanding the port facilities as deleterious, particularly for fisheries on the coasts and for inland areas across which the canal would pass. In 2011, the Panamanians finally broke ground on an expansion project for the canal that would build new locks at each side and a wider entry point so that supertankers could now pass through without interruption. The project was completed in 2016, itself a new marvel of engineering. At the same time, the return of the Sandinistas to power in 2006 with their electoral victory began to shift the balance of Nicaraguan foreign relations. Throughout Sandinista rule from 1979 to 1990, Nicaragua faced conflicted relations with the U.S. When the Sandinistas returned to power in 2006, U.S. relations with Nicaragua soured again. Nicaragua responded with closer relationships to Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and also began looking to China as a source of new trade and a potential partner to counter the U.S. Out of this developed the idea of the Gran Canal, or the Great Canal, that would be built and financed by Chinese entrepreneurs and the Chinese government. This faced the same kind of opposition that the Dry Canal had faced earlier, but now with the added element of Chinese involvement. On the one hand, this challenged U.S. hegemony in the region, which the Sandinistas valued, and allowed them to play off the two sides, China and the U.S. On the other hand, it also helped to galvanize the opposition movement, which made use of long-standing anti-Chinese sentiments in Nicaragua as a means to help build a larger coalition. The Chinese involvement was not the primary source of resentment among the opposition. The key issues were environment, indigenous rights, and Nicaraguan national sovereignty, but it did help serve as a lightning rod. Almost no work has been done on the Nicaragua Canal. The completion of the Panama Canal expansion has also tamped down demands for a new canal across Nicaragua. That said, from a Nicaraguan perspective, a canal offers a number of options that do make it attractive. Nicaragua remains a small, poor country, continuing to struggle in a world of globalization. Coffee, cotton, bananas, and other agricultural exports remain central to its economy. It has expanded into maquiladora production, which in the last 2 decades has probably added something close to 300,000 jobs in Nicaragua. But all told, none of these are long-term solutions. Nicaragua has faced devastating deforestation in the last decade, and hurricanes continue to rattle the region. Following the example of Panama, a canal across Nicaragua would produce jobs, at least in the short term, and then long-term income for the government. At the same time, it would undoubtedly have devastating environmental impacts and run through the lands of indigenous people who would lose their rights to these territories. There are no good answers for Nicaragua. There is no world in the current neoliberal paradigm where Nicaragua is anything more than a speck. The question may be that if a canal were to be built across Nicaragua, what would the income that it generates do? If we look to Panama for an answer, then Nicaragua would likely also turn towards a financialized economy with an ever greater move towards haves and have-nots. Some claim that the older revolutionary ethos of the Sandinistas would help prevent such a drastic transformation, as the income would be used instead to facilitate jobs, healthcare, education, and other opportunities. If we look to the current situation in Nicaragua, however, this too seems in doubt. Perhaps the real question we should be asking is what other options exist for the future of Central America.